Hello, I'm Dr. Steve Haberman, a writer, producer, and PhD in film studies, and I'm excited to do the commentary for Roger Corman's The Terror.
Hello, I'm novelist, screenwriter, and Baron von Lepp devotee, C. Courtney Joyner.
This movie has existed for decades, only in splicey, faded 16mm public domain prints. It's great to be seeing it like this. This little section here is taken from the middle of the movie. Corman put it at the beginning as a teaser because otherwise you don't see Boris Karloff in this movie for 20 minutes. Anyway, this movie's been mocked and derided, even by some who worked on it, mostly because of its crazy shooting history. So right up front, I want to tell you that despite its blatantly commercial origins and backward production methods, I think The Terror is unique, intriguing, cinematic, and visually gorgeous. It reminds me of the frightening confusion of a nightmare. The cinematography, especially of Big Sur and of the fog-enshrouded studio sets, has an eerie, romantic artistry, and Ronald Stein's sinister music gives it a dark gravitas. The Terror invites Freudian interpretation, too, because of its extraordinary dreamlike intensity and themes of morbid obsession and doomed love. And even though he's aging and ailing, Boris Karloff gives a terrifically emotional and dignified performance, despite the rushed confusion of his two-day shoot. In short, I love The Terror, even though I know it occasionally shows its seams and blemishes. In fact, since this movie would never have been made any other way, I value the mistakes and continuity problems as evidence of Corman's courage and skill in pulling it all together.
And there we are, immediately into this gorgeous title sequence designed and conceptualized by the wonderful Paul Julian, who, of course, had done quite a number of title sequences for Roger. I think this is absolutely his best. It's so beautiful, and it's one of its few in color. But he, of course, is probably best known for animation devotees because of his long association with Chuck Jones. And it not only did the backgrounds for How the Grinch Stole Christmas, but is the man responsible for The Desert, where Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner.
Didn't he come up with the beep beep sound?
He sure did. And of course, too, the stupendously beautiful UPA animated version of The Telltale Heart, narrated by James Mason, that he designed and executed. Just a brilliant, brilliant job.
Yeah, he was great because he worked for UPA, of course, and Warner Brothers, and he brought an artistry, a sort of gothic, surreal artistry, especially to The Telltale Heart. If you haven't seen that short, I highly recommend you see it. It's on a Columbia DVD, I think, of collected animations from Columbia at that time, and it's terrific. We also have to mention, of course, Ronald Stein. Ronald Stein was the guy who did Corman movies that wasn't Les Baxter, and he has a completely different quality, as you can hear. He uses in this one and in The Haunted Palace and some others, he uses the bass for the melody, and he uses the higher instruments for the harmony. Now, this stuff was all shot by Francis Ford Coppola of The Godfather fame, and I'm going to explain to you why right now. This is what Roger Corman said about the genesis of this movie. He said, "I was getting so familiar with the standard elements of Poe's material, or at least our adaptations, that I tried to out-Poe Poe himself and create a Gothic tale from scratch. In fact, The Terror began as a challenge to shoot most of a Gothic horror film in 2 days using leftover sets from The Raven. It turned into the longest production of my career, an ordeal that required 5 directors and 9 months to complete. But like Little Shop of Horrors, it's a classic story of how to make a film out of nothing." And that's exactly what he did here. Now, you'll notice Coppola here is directing this as if he's David Lean, with these great shots of vista shots and a very judicious use of cinema size. In other words, he goes from extreme long shots like this, and then what he'll do is he'll cut to an extreme close shot to contrast it like this. And it gives it a very exciting visual rhythm. Now, the problem was that Corman sent him to Big Sur with Jack Nicholson to shoot this in 5 days, and he was there for 11 days because he thought he was David Lean or George Stevens. he got some gorgeous stuff, and Corman even admits it, but it was a little more expensive and time-consuming than Corman had counted on, and that's why he was replaced later by Monte Hellman.
Well, of course, when Francis went to Big Sur's, with he and Jack sitting around the hotel room with Mrs. Nicholson there, Sandra Knight, that it was really almost like working off of note cards, because Roger had given Leo Gordon, I believe $1,600.
Right, $1,600.
To sit and say, okay, let's figure out a story quickly over the weekend where we can utilize Boris Karloff and those standing sets from The Raven and the other Poe pictures that were in the scene doc. And so this film, I don't know, it has this wonderful quality because it hits on all of these, if you will, not only themes, but kind of these templates that became so much a part of the Poe canon in all of the Corman films in one way or the other. But here they're just kind of these delicate grace notes that have come together in one movie rather than being separated over, all 5 or 6 films.
Yeah, I agree. And the thing about Corman and his understanding of Poe it was very much based on his Freudian analysis of Poe, was that he agreed with the themes that Poe originally mooted in his stories. I mean, both artists are obsessed with death and the inevitability of death, and both are very interested in the sexual relationship between a basically sort of weak, obsessed man and a stronger, very sexual woman. And that plays out in this as well, between Sandra Knight and the Karloff character and the Jack Nicholson character as well. What he did understand is that Poe's stories and his movies about them are about the death of a woman, the death of a beautiful woman, and a woman that is alive in death. And that certainly describes this Helene character played by Sandra Knight. She's a village girl, Helene. This is all explained in a later scene with Dorothy Newman as the witch. She's a village girl named Helene who has been hypnotized by this witch, and she's possessed by a dead woman, Ilsa, who was murdered by her husband, the Baron von Lepp. And the witch has done this so that this woman can drive the Baron von Lepp to suicide, which is, of course, going to damn him. It's against the covenant. Now, this is what Jack Nicholson said about this scene. He said, "I almost drowned out there in the ocean. I was supposed to go out into the water to find Helene. That was Francis's idea. I went out into that big fucking arch up there in Big Sur. This is wintertime and there's no stunt doubling. I had been a lifeguard, so I wasn't that afraid, but that arch is way out. The water never gets deep. So in order to look disappeared, I made this up as I was going out there. I sort of crouched down to my knees so that when the first whitewater waves hit me, it did not hit me in the dick, but all over, because that water was freezing. And the water knocked me under. When I went under with the Lieutenant Duvalier's huge 5th Chasseur uniform on, I felt I couldn't stand up. I was pinned to the ground from the weight of this uniform. I had that split second of panic because I was out of ways already. I came flying out of there and just threw that fucking costume off while I ran, freezing to death."
Well, of course, Nicholson has mentioned that quite a few times that, of course, here he was in this outfit from Western costume that was made of wool.
Wool, that's right.
And
can you imagine what that felt
that
at the bottom of the
water, like lead weights pulling him down?
I have to mention, by the way, the very Freudian symbol of that arch. I don't know if Coppola realized this or not, but Corman always felt that the doors and the windows and everything in the castles and mansions in the Poe films were symbols of the vagina in Freudian dream therapy. And that arch is very much that way too. She's first discovered, it's a very feminine symbol, she's discovered in that arch and she returns back to that arch, and that can either be a symbol of birth or of the opposite of birth, which of course is death. The other thing I want to say about this is it's very dreamlike. He falls off his horse and passes out, and when he wakes up, he finds Helene. The next thing that happens is that he passes out because he's almost drowned or something, and when he wakes up, he sees Helene again, but it's actually this woman. You know, it's this sexual girl, this very attractive girl, and that's in his consciousness, and it dissolves to this very non-sexual older woman.
And this material, I believe, is really the start of Jack Hill's contribution directorially.
And Jack Hill came after Monte Hellman. What happened was Coppola was out there for 11 days, then he got a job, and Corman wasn't too happy with him anyway because he went over schedule and over budget. Then Monte Hellman went up to Santa Barbara and Palo Verde and shot some more stuff on the coast with Jackie Hayes and with Sandra Knight and The Raven and so on. And then just to patch things up, because both Coppola and Monte Hellman were rewriting on location, Jack Hill came and shot a lot of exposition so that the thing could make sense, which it does. It actually makes sense in a kind of dreamlike logic. It reminds me of Vertigo that way. You know, it's Vertigo when you tell the story, it makes no sense. But as you're watching it, like a dream, it makes perfect sense. That everything is explained. Not plausibly, but it's explained.
And of course, there's the great Jonathan Hayes.
Jonathan Hayes, who's wonderful in this.
What would be, you know, Jack Nicholson's hallucination without Seymour Krelboyne coming through the door?
Well, it's amazing when I tell people that this is the same person who played Seymour in Little Shop of Horrors. They don't believe it. I mean, he was a very skilled actor, I think. Is a very skilled actor.
And, you know, see, something is kind of interesting that The Terror, where it fell into not just the chronology of the Poe films, but amnesia was kind of a big theme in movies at this time. And I'm thinking of, this will seem like an odd comparison, Mr. Budwing with James Garner.
Oh, yeah.
And films like that.
Mirage.
Mirage, absolutely, where characters kind of wake up in the middle of a situation they don't understand, and then we take that exploration with them as they put together the bits and pieces of their experience and how they ended up in this unconscious state with no memory.
Yeah, and it's very Freudian too, because he was interested, of course, in dreams as revealing the workings of the unconscious, which oftentimes control us. And the unconscious doesn't live in the real world; it has no eyes. It lives in memories and fantasies, and I think that's what was Corman was playing on in the Poe films. I know so because he's very articulate about it. He explains it all the time, and these films have that quality. Now I know that Coppola didn't shoot this because apparently one of the reasons that Monte Hellman had to go back and shoot stuff that had already been shot by Coppola is that Coppola forgot to tell his cameraman to shoot day for night. And this is very beautiful and skilled day for night shooting in this forest. So this was obviously reshot by Monte Hellman.
And very nice. And we should also note that Francis's own history with Corman was long and rather elaborate. Of course, he worked on The Haunted Palace. He did script revisions for Francis. Later on, movies like The Racers. And then, of course, Corman gave Francis his great directing opportunity with Dementia 13. But he became kind of his jack of all trades and was one of really the first of the film students to find themselves under Roger's wing and being given opportunities.
What's so funny is that Corman said he first offered the, shall we say, second unit, or it was more than that, but the directing on location job to Daniel Haller, his production designer, who did design the castle set that you're going to see later. And Daniel Haller turned it down because he had another job. So he said Francis Ford Coppola was my second choice as a director for The Terror.
And back and forth. And Roger, of course, was so steeped in his own cinematic commitments. And this was one of the last of the film group productions. Roger had started this offshoot company, so he was feeling a little bit under the yoke of American International for a period. and in fact was making deals with places like Pathé and doing his own productions. Little Shop of Horrors would have been one, Bucket of Blood, The Wasp Woman. And what really kind of ended that particular experiment, which this included this movie, was that black and white science fiction films were really no longer at all part of what exhibitors wanted at that point. And they had kind of phased that out. And so Roger, one last film group production, and this one was it.
Well, it was an obvious choice. I mean, his Poe movies, the ones that had been made up until this point, had all been extremely profitable, especially the first two. They'd made big money and internationally, and really started a subgenre in the horror film in the early 60s. So, you know, if he could make a film group Poe film, it would be something obvious that could play, especially with a star like Boris Karloff, because he was smart enough to use established horror stars in his Poe films.
Absolutely.
And, you know, it was an obvious. Now, this Dorothy Newman is wonderful. She specialized in witches for Roger Corman. She played another witch in a very early Corman Gothic called The Undead, which was made in 1958, I believe.
With Allison Hayes.
That's right. And she played the same kind of part, even broader than this, if you can imagine, with a pointed nose and a pointed chin. She's a little bit more of a naturalistic, believable, you know, witch in this, or person who is into witchcraft. But she specialized in that. And every once in a while, she'll turn up in these big, spectacular movies like The Ten Commandments. You'll see her, you know. But she was a Roger Corman favorite. She was in some other of his movies, I think one or two of his juvenile delinquency movies as well. And so, by the way, Jack Nicholson said, when we went up to Big Sur with Francis for the stuff along the beach and the rocks with Jackie Hayes, the horse, Helene, the young woman, and the witch's raven, Sandra got pregnant up there with our daughter Jennifer.
I have told you.
He said, I think Roger went wild with Francis because no one had ever gone over budget. And he was supposed to be up there for 3 days, and we stayed 11 or something like that. We all thought we'd be machine gunned or fired forever out of the business when we got back.
And of course, well, Jack, because Sandra got pregnant, really kind of began this whole quest of as many jobs for as many days as possible, which is why he signed on for St. Valentine's Day Massacre in a very small role, but it was scheduled for the entire production. So he got paid for everything and was offered another part in the movie.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, I've got a baby on the way. I need the cash.
I don't know who directed this scene. I don't know whether it was Coppola or whether it was Monty Hellman or Jack Hill, but it's very effective. I like this. There's always something happening in The Terror. It's never a boring film. With 5 directors and, you know, really 3 screenwriters at the very least, you can see where with rewrites it would, you know, the movie was made backwards. First they had the set, then they had the star, then they had some scenes, then they had location filming, and then they had the finished script when the movie was edited together. So the whole movie was backwards, and it's really a credit, I think, to Roger Corman that it hangs together as a kind of dreamlike horror film. This obviously is from Pit and the Pendulum. There's a lot of shots from Pit and the Pendulum of the castle. These wonderful matte shots by Albert Whitlock, and why not? I mean, they're the best castle matte shots ever made, I think.
And I think also we should know that with Monty Hellman's involvement, and Jack never shied away from getting on a horse. And of course, this was not too long after this movie that he and Monty collaborated on those 2 wonderful Westerns, The Shooting and Ride in the Whirlwind.
Yeah, those are great movies. And Corman financed those both.
Yes, he did.
And he didn't like the script of The Shooting, but he did it anyway. All right, now we're going to get to the 2-day shoot. Remarkably, Corman shot everything with Karloff in 2 days on the leftover sets of The Raven. And this is what Boris Karloff said. He said, right after The Raven, I did The Terror. It was a real quickie done in 2 days. Corman had the sketchiest outline of a story. I read it and begged him not to do it. He said, that's all right, Boris. I know just what I'm going to do. I want you for 2 days on this. I was in every shot, of course, Karloff says. Sometimes I was just walking through and then I would change my jacket and walk back. He nearly killed me on the last day. He had me in a tank of cold water for about 2 hours. After he got me in the can, he suspended operations and went off and directed 2 or 3 films to get the money, I suppose, to complete this one. Then off he went and shot the rest of the story somewhere on location in Northern California. What he really wanted to do was to shoot the sets of The Raven, which were still standing and were so magnificent. They were done by Daniel Haller, and as they were being pulled down around our ears, Roger was dashing around with me and a camera 2 steps ahead of the wreckers. It was very funny, says Karloff.
And of course, it'd be interesting to see Corman's original contract with Boris Karloff, because, of course, all the stories always go that Karloff owed Corman another 2 days, so it's The Terror. Karloff owed Corman another several days, so hence targets. And so there's, yes, always seems to be
true,
a few.
by the way.
That isn't true, and of course that's become part of cinematic legend. But
Right. No, he, Corman wanted to shoot on these sets again, and why not, in 2 days. But look at how gorgeous this is. All they did was take the fire pit out and close up the window at the top of that huge staircase, and here you have the set for The Terror. But, he made a deal with Boris, and Karloff agreed to it. Here's what Karloff said about Roger Corman. He said, I've now worked with Roger Corman twice on The Raven and The Terror. You see, Corman's strong point is as a technician, with the camera and so on. He expects the actors to get on with it. And I know Vincent Price, Peter Lorre, and I had to find our own way around because he had all he wanted. He said, you're experienced actors, get on with it. I've got the camera, my lighting, the angles, and I know how I'm going to put this together. If you asked him about advice on a scene, he'd say, that's your pigeon. Go on, I'm busy with this. This is true of the average film made under these circumstances. The director has his hands full with the mechanics of making the film, and the actor's supposed to know his job well enough to be able to give the director what he wants. Now, Corman took exception to what Karloff said, and what Corman said was that is completely and totally false. He said, I would have never said something like that. I would work with Boris and discuss the role as with any actor. I always tried to work as much as I possibly could with the actors on a short shooting schedule. On a longer schedule, you'd be able to get more rehearsal time, but unfortunately, that is one of the drawbacks of low-budget productions. Usually, what I do is talk with the actors before the picture was even shot. I would bring the whole cast in before shooting, and we'd discuss the characters, relationships, and so forth, because during shooting, there would be time for only a small amount of rehearsal. But of course, in this case, they didn't even have a finished story. They just had some scenes that Leo Gordon had written for a proposed story that they had kind of sketched out on their own. And so none of these actors knew what their motivation was going to be.
Young woman.
No, and as we said with the kind of the guideposts of the previous Poe films, with particularly with the idea of the obsession with a woman who the main character is still in love with after death, and probably, in fact, more in love with after her death.
As one is.
As one is, yes. But also, too, of course, this was, for Edgar Allan Poe, rather autobiographical. This was, of course, one of the great obsessions of his life was lost love. And he returned to that thematically in his own writings over and over again. So it only made sense that as Corman and Richard Matheson began to adapt Edgar Allan Poe, that would be the overriding theme. And it always has been in this series. And I think in this movie, in many ways, almost the ultimate example of it, because the obsession, if you will, and how it affects our main character. Here, it is about how it affects all the people around that main character. And this is a landowner, and how it affects the people who live on the estate, et cetera, et cetera. So his mental state reflects this entire world. It is not an insular closed-in thing, which it usually was, certainly in House of Usher and other things, where everyone are obsessed characters isolated. And here he actually is not, because he is the victim of a giant plot that is playing on his mental instabilities.
Yeah, he's also a victim of the supernatural. I love this horse breaking loose scene. You know, that's been given some grief, but it makes perfect sense because the horse senses the supernatural.
Absolutely.
You know,
It's the
as animals
force.
do. That's right. And he runs away. And that's why he's that's why Jack Nicholson is trapped here. What you said is very interesting, because there was a psychotherapist student of Sigmund Freud's, actually Sigmund Freud, and her name was Maria Bonaparte, and she wrote a book on Edgar Allan Poe and on analyzing Poe's personality through his tales, and through the tales Berenice, Morella, Ligeia, and Fall of the House of Usher. She said that this obsession, this returning to this theme of the dead, alive, beautiful woman, echoed Poe's precognizant memories of his mother dying, his beautiful actress mother, who died when Poe was 3 years old. And he undoubtedly had some memories of her, and he was replaying the tragedy of this death in his life. And of course, then many women that he would come in contact with, his stepmother and then his own little wife, they died of consumption in exactly the same way as his beautiful mother. And so these would replay in his tales over and over again. Sigmund Freud himself actually collaborated with Marie Bonaparte on this book and wrote the foreword to it, and it, gave her analysis of Poe his stamp of approval as the father of psychoanalysis. So she wasn't wrong, and Corman was not wrong in linking Poe and his tales with Sigmund Freud and his discovery of the unconscious and his dream therapy through characters and places that recur in our dreams. Because that's the feeling that these movies have, very much so.
Oh, absolutely.
Sam Arkoff said this. He said, at the Friday evening wrap party for The Raven, my wife and sister-in-law had prepared a veritable feast for the actors and crew. During the party, I noticed that Danny Haller's Gothic set hadn't been taken down. And I got suspicious. Those sets are normally dismantled right away, I told Jim Nicholson. Something's fishy here. Weeks earlier, he says, even before he'd started shooting The Raven, Roger had talked to me several times about using the set for a second picture, although I couldn't pin him down on what movie he might have in mind. Then he came back later claiming that he had 2 days of a script and he was going to try to get Boris Karloff for those 2 days of shooting. 2 days, Roger, I said, that doesn't make much sense. What can you pull together in 2 days? That was the last time we talked about it. Since Roger never mentioned it again, I assumed he'd dropped the idea. On Monday morning after the wrap party, I drove back to the sets. I suspected I'd find Roger there, and I was right. He was busily shooting using a clapboard that read American International Pictures of the Raven. I realized he was not only shooting another movie on our set, but charging it to the Raven's production costs. Roger was in the middle of a scene with Boris Karloff. I waited patiently in the wings until he was done with that particular shot. Roger spotted me, and I noticed a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Finally, he walked toward me. Roger, what picture are we making now? Of course, I knew the answer to my own question. Roger was shooting his second picture using AIP set. If it was anybody but Roger, I might have called the police. But Roger's Roger. He was noticeably embarrassed, but still kept his poise. He pointed at Boris Karloff, who was having some makeup applied to his face. Forcing a smile, he exclaimed, "It's that second movie, Sam, don't you remember?" He'd rounded up most of the same crew who had worked on The Raven. Leo Gordon, a character actor turned screenwriter who had written Attack of the Giant Leeches for AIP in 1959, began turning out the first few pages of the script. Meanwhile, Roger had called Karloff's agent and began negotiating. Roger was going to try to make the movie on his own for about $100,000 and tried to hire the actor for less than his normal $40,000 fee. "I only need him for 2 days," Roger pleaded. He will play the lord of a medieval castle, and he's perfect for the role." "Perfect for the role," the agent said skeptically. "You just want him for his name, don't you, Roger? You'll have to pay full price." Roger finally spoke to Boris himself, and although not having much of a script pulled together yet, he convinced the actor to give him those 2 days. In fact, they turned into a rather harrowing 48 hours. Actors were running in all directions, trying to figure out where they belonged, what they were supposed to wear, what they were supposed to say. On the second day, the 76-year-old Karloff was submerged in cold water for most of the afternoon. The chilling experience didn't do much for Karloff's health. In fact, his wife later told me that he caught a bad cold and was forced to take to bed. With Karloff on his way back to London to recuperate, and with the sets finally being torn down, Roger took a hiatus from the shooting of what would later be called The Terror, while the rest of the script was written around the scenes that were already in the can. The remainder of the picture became somewhat of an adventure for Roger, eventually shot over the better part of the next calendar year.
Well, he must leave at once.
You think perhaps he's...
One thing with Sam, and he always kind of had a habit when he referred to other people to think of their lesser credits.
Yeah,
That was kind
that's
of
funny. Put them in their place.
It put them in their place, exactly, because Leo Gordon's writing career, as a character actor, of course, everyone so remembers so many different performances. For me, brilliant in Riot in Cell Block 11.
Or The Intruder.
The Intruder, absolutely incredible, written by Charlie Beaumont and directed by Roger. And of course, in McClintock, you've caused a lot of problems here to get Pilgrim, but I'm not going to hit you.
Yeah.
I'm not going to hit you, and then pow.
Yeah.
But Leo's own writing career, not only because of his extensive involvement with Jack Webb, and you see his credits on Adam 12 and Emergency, some really fine movies with Roger, and also some of the quickie film groups, like I believe I wrote the screenplay to The Wasp Woman and a few of those. But for Gene Corman, suddenly Leo really blossomed along with his television career, probably culminating for me with Tobruk, starring Rock Hudson.
Oh, yeah. That
Which
was
is a very fine movie.
Yeah.
So, yeah, to dismiss Leo Gordon as
The leech, the
the Tag of the
Leeches, yeah.
Giant, which directed by Bernie Kowalski and produced by Gene Corman.
But Leo Gordon's great talent was as a character actor.
Oh,
He really was. He
tremendous.
was in Hondo. He was a terrific character actor. I loved him. Here's what Dick Miller said. Dick Miller here is playing Stefan, the butler. He said, "The picture was put together hurriedly when Karloff finished shooting a picture with Roger Corman and had a weekend left over. It was half a script with some basic scenes for Mr. Karloff to shoot and no plot. I was given my script with a few days' notice, and we went to work. We had 3 days to finish it. 3 days in this one. I think maybe there were 2 days with Karloff and then an extra day with maybe the other actors. I'm not sure. We shot the scenes that Boris was in with such mysterious dialogue as who was the young man last night and what was he doing, etc. I spoke to Boris about his reading lines that made no sense and asked him how he did that. He said, in pure Karloff fashion, 'When that happens, I revert to Karloff.' Then he did an imitation of himself. I didn't ask him about his health, but he was obviously not well. For example, the walk down a long flight of stairs was shortened to the last 3 steps. I drove him to the Chateau Marmont, where he was staying with his wife. I met her, and to this day I still regret having turned down an invitation to come in and have some tea. Karloff gave me a picture of himself, which mysteriously disappeared. Jack Nicholson swore he didn't take it, but to this day I'm still not sure. Boris was a perfect gentleman and professional at all times. It was a thrill working with him. About 3 or 4 months later, when we started to shoot the rest of the picture, I had forgotten what we'd shot. Corman said, "We're going to finish the picture." And I said, "What picture?"
Your horse is gone.
And
Yes.
which, yes, was kind of the problem with the film, is with the starting and the stopping. And when you mentioned also with Nicholson and his relationship with Boris Karloff, to the day he retired, Jack Nicholson said that Boris Karloff showed him how to break down a script, and that he used Boris Karloff's technique on every movie from The Raven onward.
Yeah, I remember him saying that. I think it was on a documentary about The Shining or something, and he showed how Karloff just marked his own dialogue with like a little ellipse on the script, so that he didn't have to worry about other people's dialogue. I don't know how he didn't worry about other people's cues for him, but apparently that's what he told him how to do.
Well, Karloff was like Sidney Greenstreet, for example, kind of notorious for being rather locked into what was on the page. He was fine to improvise during rehearsals and explore a little bit, But that's why Peter Lorre at times drove him absolutely nuts.
Right.
Because Peter would go completely off script and Boris would get lost. He had no idea what Lorre was saying.
Yeah, that seems like an exaggeration to me, because if you've ever seen Karloff in, like on the Red Skelton show or the Jonathan Winters show in a sketch, you know, Red Skelton didn't always stay with the script, nor did Vincent Price when he was in the sketches with Red Skelton and Boris Karloff. And Karloff seems to go with it, you know. He's. I think those stories about him and also Lugosi, of course, are a bit of an exaggeration. But I know that Karloff was very serious. By the way, I think this particular scene is one of the great Karloff scenes. Let's watch this speech.
Rebellion in the Polish province. I was gone for nearly a year. When the fighting was over, I hurried home to my bride. No one knew of my coming, and I surprised her in her room. She was not alone. She laughed at me, said her bed was not for me, to find another. With my own hands, I killed her.
And her lover?
Stefan took care of him. Later, I gave out a story that she had died of some malaise. No one ever knew of her betrayal of me, or how, in fact, she did die.
Except for Stefan.
For 20 years, I've not set foot beyond the walls of this castle. I've lived here alone with the memory of the dreadful thing I did that night. That is my penance.
And now you believe what? That the ghost of Ilsa has come back to relieve you of your penance? Is that it?
Yes,
How long has the spirit been coming to the castle?
it all began 2 years ago. At first I was terrified, but now I'm eager for our every meeting.
One more question, Baron. Has anyone else except yourself seen the spirit? Stefan, for instance.
You think I'm mad, don't you?
Right now, Baron, I'm not sure just what I think.
But don't forget, you saw her too. Perhaps we're both mad.
Pretty damn good.
And that's great. Now,
Pretty
yes,
damn
everyone
good.
could applaud.
Yeah.
And from the, also too, you know, Steve, as of course we're watching this wonderful moment between Boris Karloff and Jack Nicholson. That is a single setup on both actors, and
Right.
so Karloff, right, top to bottom, just went for it.
Yeah.
In that tremendous speech, and as I said, going into Karloff mode and shifting his attitude.
He
and
may
his
not have
movement.
known where the script was going, but he played every moment of that scene.
Absolutely.
It was
And-
believable and dramatic and heartbreaking.
And of course, coming back to a line like, you know, you think I'm mad.
Yes. And I
how
love the
many
way
times
Corman
did he
fades
have-
out a little too
Yes.
early.
How many times did he have to say that over the years in his
Yes.
career?
Well, we thought he was mad anyway. This scene, by the way, I love. I think Monty Hellman shot this. I don't know, but I think he did. But it has that Poe quality. It reminds me of Annabelle Lee, doesn't it?
Oh, very
you
much
know, in
so.
A Kingdom by the Sea.
Kingdom by the Sea,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and I think actually Sandra Knight's quite good in this scene. You know, she has a very American quality, like her husband Jack Nicholson, which doesn't always work with this European Gothic sensibility. But even so, there's something very haunting, dreamlike, especially the fact that Monty Hellman, or whoever directed this, was wise enough to keep the sea in the background the whole time, like the churning unconscious of these characters.
And well, Sandra Knight had, as you said, this very American quality that in another film written by Leo Gordon, actually with Vincent Price, but another one of Rogers' away from AIP productions, Tower of London, she does seem out of place there.
Well, Tower of London, I think, is almost a complete misfire. I think that was Corman and his brother Gene were betrayed by the executive producer who cut their budget the weekend before shooting. He thought he was going to shoot it in CinemaScope color, and and be able to, stage the Battle of Bosworth.
And we should say that was Edward Small.
Yes,
who
it was Edward Small.
Who
It
was
was
quite
indeed.
quite a fellow.
Yeah, he was quite a fellow, but he really betrayed Corman, and that movie might have been able to be good, but I think that if you compare it to Roland V. Lee's Tower of London, which you shouldn't be able to compare it to because that was a big budget studio film, but even so.
And which they used stock footage from in
yes,
the other version. And of course, Vincent Price also was in the 1939.
yeah,
film.
and is terrific in the 1939 film. He's not too good as Richard III. I think
No.
somebody needed to put some weights in his boots in that one. he's way over the top, and I love Vincent Price in almost everything, but that one's not. And that's the thing. I mean, that movie, I don't think works. This movie, despite the fact that it was shot backwards, I think works beautifully. That little device there, I think, was the same one used in Tales
of Terror, absolutely.
The year before this, Basil Rathbone.
Basil Rathbone is Mr. Carmichael.
Mr. Carmichael, and he's hypnotizing Monsieur Valdemar, who's played by Vincent Price quite well, with this same device. Now, if you'll notice in this scene, all of the dialogue seems to be looped of Dorothy Newman's to Sandra Knight. So apparently this was shot with a different explanation. Now, see, her lips don't match what's being said, but what's being said completely explains what's going on in this movie. This is a very important exposition scene. She is causing the spirit of Ilsa, who was murdered by somebody, to possess this girl Helene, and now Helene is going to drive the Baron von Lepp to suicide, thinks Dorothy Newman. And it's very important. So I would love to know what the original dialogue was for.
Well, when looking at this scene, what I also see is Roger Corman and all these young guys, Coppola and Monty Hellman and Jack Hill, everybody sitting in a screening room going, okay, now what?
Yeah, how are we going to explain this?
How are we going to explain this?
But they do.
Yes.
They do. I think Dick Miller's great in this scene. He's another very American actor, but he's such a good actor. I believe him as anything. And after all, I don't know where this is supposed to be. It's on the Baltic coast someplace, one of those Baltic countries, Croatia or something. And I don't think anybody even knows what a Croatian accent would be. But, this is an American film with an American cast and American director, so it doesn't bother
With Jack Nicholson as a member of Napoleon's army.
Yes, that's
supposedly.
right.
Yes.
Without a French accent, that's okay. it's a strange thing.
mercenary.
It's a strange thing in movies. I mean, when you're making a movie in English about the French, where everybody's supposed to be speaking French, should they have French accents, or should they just be speaking in natural English? The same thing in Pit and the Pendulum. Should they all have Spanish accents? Probably not,
Well, you and I, Steve, have talked about this many times, but of course, when the origin point of the Poe series with House of Usher, of course, was Hammer Films lighting the fuse with color gothics.
Right.
With Curse of Frankenstein, Horror of Dracula, and The Mummy had all arrived and had just broken box office records everywhere. So suddenly the idea of period pieces with actors, older actors, set in sometimes mythical European locations, whatever. It was wonderful. Joe Dante made this point that these movies were popular with teenagers, and they starred people in their 50s and up.
Which belies the philosophy of Hollywood now, that that young audiences will only identify with young characters on screen, which is complete and utter nonsense. When I was growing up, I identified with guys in their 50s, 60s, and 70s because they're compelling. And let's face it, young actors are callow because young actors are young people, and young people don't know shit. So I prefer watching. Like the tragedies of ancient times, my superiors, my social and intellectual superiors, acting out the great passions, so that I know what it's supposed to be a grown up.
And of course, too, what we're talking about is the very antithesis, one of the things that American International started, which was the audience wanted to see people their own age in the movies that they were paying for.
Yeah.
So Teenage Werewolf and Teenage
Yeah,
Frankenstein.
AIP really initiated that philosophy.
Absolutely, they
Yeah.
did. And then here they kind of reversed themselves because...
Well, because Corman, look, even when Corman was making those 2-week black and white movies in the 50s, they were auteur works, whether they were, juvenile delinquency movies or rock and roll movies or whatever. They were always about the inevitability of death, and they had this pessimistic viewpoint that life was meaningless. Watch Teenage Doll one of these days.
Or
it's one of,
Rock All Night.
or Rock All Night. These are some of the darkest movies made in the 50s. They're completely nihilistic. So I don't think Corman ever signed on for the philosophy that, you couldn't make a tragedy or at least a dark melodrama, with young people. You could. And, he always had a Mark Damon or a Jack Nicholson or a John Kerr, these actors that represented the audience. But I don't think the audience identified with those characters.
No, I don't think so
I think
either.
the audience identified with Vincent Price.
And they certainly were more vested in Vincent Price. And we should note that, of course, American International, simultaneous with the enormous success of the Poe movies, were also having the enormous success of the Beach Party movies.
Right. Yeah. It's a slightly different audience.
Yes. But so there you go. You had for the two different audiences from the same company hitting their targets. Separately.
It's wonderful how Corman, in post-production, gave this movie a very professional sheen with the credit sequence that we talked about by Paul Julian, and with this wonderful orchestral score by Ronald Stein. It gives the movie an importance that you wouldn't think it could earn given its production history. But he took the movie seriously, and he knew that audiences who went to go see a Roger Corman Gothic expected certain ingredients, and a lot of people went to go see this was made right after The Raven, so The Raven hadn't been released yet, but the audience had already enjoyed House of Usher, Pit and the Pendulum, The Premature Burial, and Tales of Terror, all at least as good as Hammer's best product, and some would say a couple of those were even better. So he had his own reputation to live up to.
And when we were speaking again of Ronald Stein, who I think is so underappreciated, his beautiful score for this, it's so lush. And these films tended to be music heavy. So there was a lot of responsibility placed on his shoulders and Les Baxter's shoulders. But I think this score and the Haunted Palace score is just fantastic. Absolutely magnificent.
And my favorite really is the one that seems least appreciated, which is The Premature Burial, with its use of Molly Malone.
Molly Malone, yes.
Yeah, I think Ronald Stein was... I love Les Baxter, too. He's completely different, though. Les Baxter is much more melodic. He has a much more lush harmonic sound, and Ronald Stein is he's sort of the Bernard Herrmann of AIP. It's a very dark, moody, kind of haunting sound. And it really does give the movies a great deal of importance. Even a movie like Dementia 13, which had even, a more spotty production history than this, he just elevates whatever he scores, and he was a wonderful addition. He died way too young.
And this is, of course, one of the great examples of Boris Karloff cites, I walked down a hallway. Then Roger said, walk down the other way. And then I walked again.
But you know what? It all comes together.
And absolutely it all comes together.
Yeah, you're with Duvalier. You want to find out what the hell who is this woman that's so beautiful that I'm attracted to? And is she a ghost? She can't be. I kissed her. This is wonderful.
And always the intrusion when our central character is communicating with the dead, and someone will always interrupt him.
Right. And I find that to be true in my own life.
It will save us both embarrassment if he will leave the moment he returns.
There can be no doubt of it, sir.
will, sir. You're doing the best.
As we go back on location with Lieutenant Duvalier, I want to tell you what Monty Hellman said about his directing stint on The Terror. He said, "I made the last version of the movie. There'd been several versions before, but I made the one that finally got released. Roger had shot some scenes on a set he'd been using for another picture, and he said, before we tear it down, let's get Boris Karloff to walk around and do a few scenes. So based on that material and some scenes Francis Coppola had shot, I shot for 5 more days, and we finished the film. Contrary to Beast from Haunted Cave, The Terror was a lot of fun. On the 4 pictures I expanded, I really had autonomy. I wrote the scripts for and produced and directed the scenes I was expanding, and I did the same thing on The Terror. I found the challenge of making a movie in 5 days exciting, especially with no budget. Instead of getting a wrangler to bring a horse out, we went to Griffith Park stables, rented a horse and trailer, and brought them to the set. And nobody could get the horse back into the trailer after we'd finished shooting. It just refused to go. Finally, actor Jonathan Hayes said, "What will you pay me to get the horse into that trailer?" I was going crazy because when you have 5 days to shoot, if you lose 10 minutes, it's like losing 3 days on a normal movie. So I said, "I'll give you $50. So he walked up to the horse, whispered into its ear, and the horse walked into the trailer. I said, "You got to tell me, what did you say to it?" He said, "I told him that if he didn't get into the trailer, I was going to beat the shit out of him."
That is so much the legend of low budget movie making. It just has to be true. I think
Yeah, it
that's
has to be
so
true.
magnificent.
Now, Jack Hill takes credit for this scene because what Jack Hill said was, he said, after Monty Hellman was done, Corman looked at it and said, "We need some more." And this movie was a horror movie, but it didn't have much horror in it. So Jack Hill said, "I went up with Jackie Hayes and the Falcon, and I did this scene where the Falcon attacked Jackie Hayes and plucked his eyes out." And he said, "I made it as gory and violent as I possibly could." Now, this movie was made at the same time that The Birds was released in 1963, so I doubt if he had seen The Birds, but it has that quality, doesn't it? Especially this moment. And he has a real good fall. It's a dummy, but man, it bounces off the rocks and it looks pretty nasty. So it gave another horror hit to this movie. It gave another highlight of gruesomeness.
And there we go. And you're right. That dummy death actually is good because there's a center of gravity to the dummy itself.
Yes.
So it doesn't have that
Right.
weird bending spine thing that you usually
Yeah,
see.
the Colin Clive effect, we call it.
Exactly. Yes. Off the windmill blade.
That's right. So yeah, and this is wonderful too. His cape fluttering. This is so gothic. The churning sea and the man in a cape, and it's just so wonderful.
Oh,
and
no,
there's
it's
so
almost,
many
it's almost,
highlights.
you could look at it. I don't know. Whenever I see these scenes, for some reason, I think of Wuthering Heights or something.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Well, that's the way they advertised House of Usher. They said it was a combination of Diabolique and Wuthering Heights. So Corman knew exactly what he was doing as he was inventing this Poe genre. He was giving the shock qualities of modern horror at the same time as that sort of classic quality of period horror.
Well, and speaking of capes, I think Boris Karloff was probably a little bit relieved that he got to wear these dressing gowns in these quick shoots for The Terror, although he was always plagued with back problems since the 1930s. But he had horrible, if you will, the time with the very heavy cloak he had to wear in The Raven.
Yes. Well,
And it really weighed him down. He looks like a crab.
Yes, he publicly complained about that in an interview. He said that Corman forced him to wear that cape and walk down those stairs. And now this is a set from The Haunted Palace. The Haunted Palace, you say? I thought he was shooting on the sets of The Raven. Well, he was. But when the movie had been shot for a few months, by that time, Corman was working on The Haunted Palace, and he had benefit of those sets. And I want to quote Roger Corman on that. "What finally pulled The Terror together was several months later I started shooting The Haunted Palace. I paid director of photography Floyd Crosby and everybody else a little bit extra to stay on. And after we finished shooting with Vincent Price, Vincent went home and Dick Miller and Jack Nicholson came in and I shot them on the sets of The Haunted Palace. Now you can see the sets of The Haunted Palace, the graveyard, and later on there's a tree outside of this crypt, Ilsa's crypt, that seems to be the very tree that they burn Vincent Price on at the beginning of The Haunted Palace. And at the end, in the flood scene, we'll point it out when we see it, is the big sort of wooden stairway that goes into the cellar of the Haunted Palace. They use that quite well when Jack Nicholson is carrying Sandra Knight up the stairs after she's been in the flood down in Baron von Lepp's crypt. Very clever of Corman to use that. He almost never mentions using the sets from the Haunted Palace. I wonder if he ever asked Arkoff's permission to do that.
No, I'm sure he didn't.
I'm sure he didn't too.
In fact, it just, as we pointed out, and Dick Miller, God bless him, had pointed this out beforehand, that because of the protracted starting and stopping in the shooting of The Terror and Sandra Knight's pregnancy, she did change physically while the movie was
Yes.
being made.
Yes. In the flooding scene, she's a little bit heavier, shall we say.
Yes. And
Dick Miller said he changed too. He said his sideburns go up and down, and he gained and lost weight, and that he was tanned in some of it and not so tanned in other parts of it, because it was a nine months difference between the 2 or 3 days shooting on the Raven sets and the location shooting.
well, of course, too, with Nicholson, here he was splitting his time and attention between the things with Roger Corman, what he was going to be doing, of course, with Monty Hellman, with those two wonderful westerns, writing Head and being involved with Bob Rafelson and the Monkees.
Yeah.
And then, too, his major studio work was starting to come to the fore soon, because this was soon he would be in On a Clear Day You Can See Forever, which was the first really big studio film in which he made any sort of an impression. And still, but with Roger, St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and a few other things. So he was kind of jumping around from hither and yon, and I loved it that Hazel Court, when asked, what did you think of Jack Nicholson back in the days of The Terror? And she said, well, he was like this little elf who just kept popping up here and there all over the place with this wonderful energy. And I always thought
he was a very ambitious guy.
Very.
You know, he never worked for Francis Ford Coppola again, and the theory is that there was one shot in the montage in the beginning where he was running around with Helene, and they were falling in love, where Coppola had the crew gather a bunch of butterflies, live butterflies on location, and Nicholson was supposed to run through a field with Sandra Knight, and the crew was going to release these butterflies for this wonderful bucolic moment, you know, as contrast to the rest of the Gothic horror. And when it came time to do it, everything was set up, and Nicholson came running behind Sandra Knight, and they were ready to release these butterflies, and Nicholson started flapping his arms like wings as the butterflies flew up. And Coppola said, "Cut, what are you doing? All morning they've been collecting butterflies." And Nicholson said, "Oh, is this the take?" And that was the last time Jack Nicholson worked with Francis Ford Coppola. So you can take that.
Although they remained good friends.
I don't know that. I wouldn't forgive anybody for that. Here's what Nicholson said about working with Francis on The Terror. He said, when we got back to town, this is after they were shooting on location at Big Sur, Francis tried to blame me for going over budget, I might add. And of course, he didn't know that I was pretty close with Roger from having worked with him and being in Jeff Corey's acting classes. Roger didn't believe I was to blame. Neither did Francis, really. It had more to do with shooting in Big Sur and trying something you never do on a Corman picture, which was run cables up from the rocks into the mountains. Roger's way would be to just shoot up from the road, but Francis hadn't worked with Roger that much, so he hadn't that disdain for any of the production expense, but he didn't have that burned into him yet. So he went ahead and just did whatever he wanted. And then Nicholson said this about Monty Hellman. He said, then moving south down the coast, Monty Hellman came on board, and we shot in Santa Barbara and Palos Verdes. More Raven stuff, more scenes with Jackie Hayes. Now, this looks to me like Dr. Craven, Vincent Price's cellar from The Raven. That's what I see here, is the set where he goes down to find some kind of way to turn the Raven back into Peter Lorre. And his father's crypt is down there. He has to cut some locks of hair from his father for this potion.
For the magic potion. That's
Yes,
right.
to turn the Raven back into Peter Lorre. So I think that's what this set is.
And one thing, too, I think about this film that is also wonderful is that because of Karloff's association with AIP and with Roger, but it was The Raven, it was Comedy of Terrors, it was even appearing in a cameo in
Bikini Beach?
Bikini Beach.
Yes.
The
Such monsters, he
lampooning
says.
of himself had become part of his formula, at least here. And that's why I love The Terror, and I love Die Monster Die. And
Yes, he's quite serious.
he plays, yes, straight and serious performances in these horror films.
Yeah, I think those two titles that you mentioned, I think, are very underrated movies. I as I said in the beginning, I love The Terror. And I also love Die Monster Die. Everybody is so up in arms against it because it's not a literal translation of The Color Out of Space, the H.P. Lovecraft short story. But in my opinion, it's better. I mean, The Color Out of Space, this may be heretical to say, you know, it takes place in a rural area with some, you know, kind of inbred types, which is interesting. But setting it in England with Boris Karloff, I think, is wonderful.
And yes, and all the mutated farm animals and things
Yeah.
like that. Yes.
And mutated farm animals is not as interesting to me as Boris Karloff's mutated wife.
Yes,
With-
absolutely.
With a knife, you know, in the fog at Oakley Court. That, to me, that's a movie I can sign on to. But I like both of those movies, and they take themselves quite seriously. I think after Black Sabbath, they're the best AIP serious horror movies that Karloff made. I think really the best AIP movie Karloff made was Corman's The Raven, because Corman is actually an auteur, and the movie has a depth that few people give it credit for. Plus, it's beautifully directed and written, and I just love it.
Well, also, we're talking about a time period here where Boris Karloff still had some body weight, and the contrast between Karloff in this period and, say, a film like Michael Reeves' The Sorcerers
Yes, he's quite
is
frail in that.
really startling.
Yeah.
And he looks very frail. Not
They,
as
they hide his frailty. Bogdanovich hid his frailty very well with great dialogue scenes and acting, you know. But you're right. In The Sorcerer, he just, you know, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to watch because he just doesn't look well.
No, as also true in The Crimson Cult.
Oh, that movie to me is unwatchable. It's just a terrible script, badly directed. Such a missed opportunity. A movie with Boris Karloff, Christopher Lee, Barbara Steele, and Michael Goff, and it stinks. You know, you have to work to make a movie that bad.
And although I do still have the Ken Films 200-foot condensation of it.
Keep that. That's probably the best version.
And, you know, I actually used to have a 8mm black and white feature length version of this film
Oh, really?
on Super 8.
I bet this
Yep.
looks great in black and white.
Actually, it did. If it hadn't been quite so doopy, yes. But surprisingly, it did. And somehow, I think first exposure to this movie for me was on television and a little portable black and white set on UHF.
I saw this movie on TV. I think I know I saw it in color, and I was fascinated by it, especially the last shot. It haunted me. But just the gothicness of it. And I had seen the Poe films at the drive-in. 2 years in a row, our local drive-in showed a triple or quadruple feature. My parents would only let me see the first two, which were The Raven and Mask of the Red Death. And I was so impressed. I mean, they were so big and loud and beautiful and colorful and, you know, frightening and gothic and, you know. And then I saw this on television and I saw the resemblance. This wasn't as as compelling, but still it had those ingredients that are so haunting in Corman's Gothics.
Well, Steve, you're bringing up a very good point too. Was American International kept these movies in circulation for a decade, and I had my sister worked in a movie theater when she was a teenager, and the manager of the theater gave me a stack of American International press books, and this would have been about 1972, and they included Spend the Night with Boris Karloff.
Oh yeah, after
and
he died,
Spend the Night with Vincent Price. Absolutely.
Yes, I went to that. After Karloff died, they released 5 features of Karloff's as a tribute to him in 1970, and it was the 5 features. It was Die Monster Die, The Terror, Black Sabbath, The Raven, and The Comedy of Terrors, and we went. And the first 2 features at my drive-in were The Raven and Comedy of Terrors, and somehow they slipped in The Sorcerers after that, because they had changed up my drive-in had changed up the menu, and that was the first time I saw The Sorcerers, which I liked. I thought it was good. Everybody else in the car was asleep, but I watched the whole thing.
Well, again, it just shows, I think, the staying power and how these movies really planted their flags with audiences long after the filmmakers had gone on to other things, in some cases the great beyond.
Well, like Hammer films, because they're in period and they take themselves seriously, they don't date.
That's right.
It's like watching Wuthering Heights, the Goldwyn version of Wuthering Heights. Even though it's made in the 30s, it doesn't date as badly as movies made in the 30s that take place in the 30s. Now, movies like that don't bother me.
No.
Because in my mind, I can imagine myself in the 30s watching this movie. Dating is not something... movies dating, or that's like literature dating. It's like somebody saying, well, I can't read something from the 19th century because people don't write like this. And that's nonsense. That's their value to me. A lot of people have a hard time with some of the Universal classics like Dracula because they don't make movies like that anymore. I say good. I like that they made movies like that in the early 1930s. That's their value. Here we are back on the set of The Haunted Palace, by the way. This is really beautiful, and you can tell this was shot by Floyd Crosby.
Yes.
The lighting in the interiors of the Raven set is a little flat. Even Corman admitted that. But look at this. It doesn't get better than that shot. The fog, the blue light. It's just beautiful.
And of course, let's bring the fog in to make sure
yeah,
that we
so
match
for continuity. Yeah.
These wonderful
well,
long shots.
That's the great thing about this. Even though the movie was made under these crazy conditions, backwards as I say, it hangs together. It's wonderful. This is a terrific scene. There's a spiritual quality to this movie. His Poe movies are quite secular, I think, because I think Roger Corman is quite secular. He's much more interested in Freud and psychotherapy than he is in Christianity, unlike, say, Terence Fisher at Hammer, or even, some of the early Gothic novels like Dracula and Frankenstein from the 19th century. But this movie actually has a spiritual quality because her evil plan was to revenge herself on the Baron von Lepp by getting him to commit suicide, which of course goes against the covenant and would damn him. He would spend eternity burning in hell for that. And she's a witch. She sold her soul to the devil. So she can't go into that chapel. And Corman is going to show us, Corman is directing all of this now. Corman is going to show us what happens to her when she goes in there. And this gives it a kind of spiritual quality that the other Corman Poe films don't have. The closest one, I guess, that does would be Tomb of Ligeia. But the rest of them are basically about madness and obsession.
And also, too, of course, it was the derivation of Lovecraft. But I think, too, The Haunted Palace, of course, has the major streak in that because burning Vincent Price for heresy.
Right. Well, yeah, like you said, that's Lovecraft. Well, he's another secularist. Yeah. But he came at it from a different position. He didn't reject Christianity. He rewrote Christianity.
Yes, exactly.
He came up with his own pagan gods and his own demons. And basically, he posited a universe without God, but with these creatures from another dimension. And that's a third way to go, I guess. But this actually is is based on Christian dogma. Because this witch is, as witches were in medieval times, they were a reaction to the sort of establishment insistence on Christianity. And the pagan religions became a reaction to the way Christianity oppressed the pagan religions and called them satanic. And so the pagan religions said, okay, then we're satanic. Boy, he gets beat up a lot in the end of this movie.
Yes, he does.
Everybody takes a whack at him.
But at least we've had this wonderful moment where she literally makes sense of all the twists and turns. And
Well, this is the final twist and turn, and this was done at the last minute. Corman cut the movie together as it was coming, and he said, "You know what? It needs one more twist." And the final twist is that the Baron von Lepp is not the Baron von Lepp. He's Eric. He's the Baron's wife's lover, who killed the Baron and went mad
And took his place.
Is now thinks he's the Baron. And on top of that, Eric is the witch's son. So she has been plotting to kill her own son and damn him to hell for committing suicide.
exactly.
So now all of a sudden she's got to stop him from flooding the crypt.
Yes, if she can. Of course, we did mention this. It was rather remarkable that Boris Karloff is her son.
Yes. Which is
Well, that adds a whole nother dimension to.
that's a bit of an insult to the actress Dorothy Newman, but she went with it.
But she went along with it.
Yes.
And,
So now this is good. The intercutting of Dick Miller trying to break in from this point, and Jack Nicholson going back to the crypt and trying to break in, with Sandra Knight trying to talk the Baron, or who's actually Eric, into flooding the crypt. It gets quite exciting here.
well, and it also it's got the one element that perhaps the movie did not have ever, and that is a ticking clock. They
Right.
decided to go ahead and let's.
Well, Corman was always good at the third act climaxes in his Poe movies. I mean, the ending of House of Usher is exciting with the fire and a mad Madeline, and of course the Pit and the Pendulum. You can't do better than that. You have a pit and a pendulum, right?
That's it.
And Mask of the Red Death. Red Death finally invades, and I love this.
Yes, I
This
made
is
my
fantastic.
pact with another.
Right. All she had to do was step foot in the crypt, and that's what happens to her.
Yeah, that's some real divine justice.
Yeah,
there.
real divine justice, which gives this movie, as I said, a spiritual quality that I admire. And it gives it, a seriousness and a tragic quality. Even she's a tragic character. She was so misguided. She was going to try to make the Baron von Lepp damn himself, and what she ended up doing was having her own son damn himself.
And all of this, of course, is balanced on the fact that the original act was marital indiscretion. It was nothing colossal. No one was celebrating the Black Mass. No
Right.
one, there was nothing like that. It was actually a wife taking a lover, and that set all of this tragedy in motion.
Well, that's what makes it a piece with the other Poe films too, because Pit and the Pendulum and The Haunted Palace, they all have to do with marital indiscretion and a very aggressive sexual woman, in this case a woman we don't meet, the Baroness von Lepp, destroying a sort of aesthete, a man of sensitivity for her own sexuality. And now, because he murdered her, she's going to take revenge from the grave through possessing Helene.
And of course, he's so guilt-ridden that his mind has twisted the act itself, literally reversed it, that he believes that he not responsible ultimately for her death but still must join her. And these cutaways are absolutely wonderful.
And who shot those?
This is Dennis Jacobs.
Dennis Jacobs. He was sent by Corman to go out to Hoover Dam and shoot water with many different lenses, close, closer, and closest. And that was very cleverly, because, Corman is very good at these flurries of montage, because normally he uses a moving camera. He wasn't allowed to use the moving camera so much in this because of his rush shooting schedule. But he did sometimes in the Raven set. But when things get exciting, he's like Hitchcock. He goes for a flurry of images, and it does cause a cinematic excitement, and he's going to do that right now.
And we wonder about the timing, say, if you will, of when this material with Sandra Knight was shot, because also, they want a dreamlike quality, and she does. She looks like an apparition in those long shots, but she is heavier.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is what Jack Nicholson said. He said, when we did the flood scenes, I had to dive from the stairs leading to the crypt into 2.5 feet of water, which is why that dive looks a little funny. And by then, Sandra was like 7-8 months pregnant, and her body was obviously quite different. And there I was carrying her upstairs, soaking wet, with her very pregnant. I remember standing behind Roger when I wasn't in the shot, because he was holding one of the big fire hose nozzles over his head, squirting the actors as the crypt filled up. I grabbed the hose without him knowing it, being almost hysterical with laughter as I pulled the hose and jerked him around while he was spraying these people, making it seem like a tremendous water pressure. This was my fucking wife, and it looked so hysterically goofy. Roger always had that grin on his face. He knew something was up. It was a great time.
But this sequence,
I think,
with
it's very
the Dennis
impressive.
Jacob material, and in this, it's big.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It belies its budget and the production circumstances. He intercuts from. That's from the House of Usher.
Yes.
He intercuts from the beach. This is from the Hoover Dam. There's poor Boris in water up to his chest, cursing the day he ever met Roger Corman. And later you'll see the stuff shot on the set of The Haunted Palace with water, and you'll notice that Karloff's, if you notice, Karloff's stunt double does not have white hair, but it's okay. And it all cuts together. This, I think, is very impressive.
Yes.
Blowing the side of the set loose, and water comes rushing in. It's quite impressive. And what Corman said is, I couldn't burn down another castle or mansion. I'd burned down so many castles and mansions at the end of these Poe films. Oh, here's a set from The Haunted Palace, this wonderful stairway.
Over the demonic.
That's right, over the demonic pit of Yog Sothoth or whoever is down there.
And here's Jack back into the
There he
water
is,
in
jumping.
his uniform
Right,
again.
poor guy. And he's got to carry his pregnant wife out.
From all the styrofoam bric-a-brac.
Yes. It looks great, though.
It does, and there's only that one tiny little shot where you actually can see the fire hose stream.
Oh, I never
And it's
noticed.
just very brief.
Yeah. But, what Corman said was, I thought, what's the opposite of fire? And that's how he got the idea.
And yes, and not to use that shot of the barn roof collapsing.
Right.
in
I
flames
think
one more time.
he never, of course, foresaw the ability of everybody to own these movies and, like have their own Corman Poe Film Festival.
Or even that American International, he would end up making so many, and that AIP would end up releasing them as
Yeah.
a set and in theaters.
I think that's the tree.
That's the
From
tree.
The Haunted Palace. This is an incredibly memorable and impactful ending. This is one of the best scenes in this movie, and this movie is full of great scenes, I think.
I've always loved this. It's wonderful and very gruesome makeup effect. And I would say one thing about the Poe films, whenever they have addressed anything like the disintegration of a human being, they've always gone for the liquid,
Yes, the gooey version.
viscous, gooey, yes, horrible.
And this is the best one. This is better,
Oh,
I think,
absolutely.
than Monsieur Valdemar. This is really quite good because they poured the butterscotch over an actual skull for the last shot. The beautiful woman who's dead but alive, which also means she's alive but dead.
Alive but dead. And boy, when you're in love with either a ghost or a corpse, it's kind of
It's not going to end well.
a dead
Yeah.
end. Yes.
Well, I hope you enjoyed watching The Terror now more than ever, because we did. And
We sure
this
did.
is Dr. Haberman, and I'm signing off.
And this is Courtney Joyner. Thank you so much for listening.